Everyone knows Michigan is home of Detroit Rock City.
And one of the reasons we're here is because it reminds us of Detroit Rock City!
In the 60s and 70s, some of the greatest and best-known rockers came from Detroit, such as MC5, Ted Nugent, Bob Seger, shock rock pioneer Alice Cooper, and proto-punk pioneer Iggy Pop. Many acid rock bands were birthed in Michigan as well, such as SRC, Frigid Pink, and Rodriguez. There would be no metal without acid rock or blues rock, so it's no leap to say that in a way, the metal scene started here. The metal scene in Michigan really took off in the 1980s, and with great diversity, with thrash bands such as Infest, Ugly But Proud, Gore, Drop Hammer, Blasphemous, Harm's Way, Halloween, and many, many more. It can easily be said that the thrash scene was thriving in the early years of Michigan. The hardcore scene was also very strong during this time, with bands like Screaming Bloody Leopard Children, Feisty Cadavers, and the relatively successful bands Cold as Life and Negative Approach. There was even a doom band called Coven 13. There was also a lot of room for the hair bands such as Dead Engine, Weapons, Seduce, The Almighty Strut, and Necropolis. Last for 80s metal is the legendary band Repulsion, a band from Flint that has been a great pioneer for grindcore and have been credited for being one of the first bands to use blast beats on a record. The scene in the 90s was on fire. On top of more groove and thrash bands forming and releasing albums, it also had no shortage of black metal. Bands like Summon, Masochist, Lucifer's Hammer, Wind of the Black Mountains, and the Lords of Algol had arrived to the scene. In fact, Summon has been credited to being one of the first black metal bands in the USA. Michigan also saw its share of death metal in the 90s, with bands such as Unholy Death, Arioch, Zombified Preachers of Gore, and Amputist. The metal certainly didn't die in the 2000s, and it became a lot more diverse. There has been no shortage of death metal, with bands like Writhing, All Creation Wept, Apostle of Perversion, and Some Are Dying setting their place in the scene. Black metal had a few newcomers to the scene as well, with bands Cemetery Desiccator and Gnosia. Thrash metal bands Wastelander, Hellmouth, and Soldiers of Scrape came by to tell us thrash isn't going anywhere. Overload, a traditional metal band, and Left in Ruin, a stoner metal band, are a few others that should not go unmentioned. Mainstream success is also to be found with bands Wolfhook, Battlecross, Black Dahlia Murder, and King 810. At the tail end of it all in the 2010s, the story has mostly been the same as it was in the 2000s, with a few bands gone and a few new ones coming to the scene. Doom bands like Tomb of Teeth, thrash bands like Death Pit, Manic Outburst, and Euphoria, and with mellow black death metal band Nightkin, black metal band Cult of Apophis, and prog metal band Rite of Passage, there is still no shortage of metal to this day.
Stormy night, the villagers gather and center and pound the torches, burn and cry, as the Holy One preaches and circles around their Bibles in hand.
Hotspots for metal bands to play have changed throughout the years. However, the most successful places historically have been the original Blondies on 7 Mile, which earned a top 6 spot on VH1's Top 10 Heavy Metal Clubs in America, and a place called the Falcon Club. In the 80s and 90s, East Detroit had a great hotspot for metal with a place called Arioch, where bands with national success would play. It has since been closed down sadly, but when it was still open, it was almost like a heavy metal museum. Other places include Harpo's, the Main Act, the Token Lounge, and the Marquee Club. Sadly, many of these places are closed or are in a bad area now. According to the band Against the Grain, who have played across the states, Michigan has one of the greatest metal scenes in the country. It goes without saying that the exception to this would be the high-density areas like California and New York. Still, there are countless bands, a great deal of diversity, and one can easily pull in more than 100 people in a local venue. Detroit and its suburbs seem to be a great spot for the local scene, as well as where many of the bands in Michigan come from. Perhaps it's because that area is still rather industrious, and so people are continuing to create music that sounds the way that their environment feels. The roots of metal is, after all, music made by the working class and for the working class. That is just as true now as it was back when Black Sabbath formed. Michigan metal hasn't been without its backlash from the general public, however. A metal venue called Black and Moon in Lansing had some flack thrown their way when there was a shooting in the parking lot after hours, after one of the very few rap shows that had played there. More recently, in the village of Port Sanilac, a heavy metal band playing a gig down at the docks one summer had the police called on them, and one drummer was tackled by a police officer with no warning. Perhaps like many bands in the country, the scene has also seen a change in how the bands are treated. Originally, bands were treated like royalty with free beer and other nice things, whereas now they charge bands just for some water. They also began to make bands sell tickets and give owners in the clubs all the money, and many bands had to pay to play. This hit the scene in the early 90s really hard. MTV and the rap genre has also negatively affected turnout for metal bands, not to mention the cigarette ban in bars and restaurants has driven away the crowd. I guess people don't want to go to a show only to step out every 20 minutes or so to have a smoke. It's more difficult for bands to get ahead these days, and they usually perform in small venues. They have also become more community-oriented in more recent times. Originally, it was almost an Ayn Rand approach where every band was for themselves, but now there's a much more collective effort to help one another. Today's mosh pits are also almost non-existent. It's mostly just 5 or so guys barely touching each other, going in circles. But that wasn't always the case. Skinheads from East Side and West Side would engage in one another with closed fists at places like Harpo's. In conclusion, there is something in the Michigan scene for everyone, with bands such as Euphoria, Torn in Two, Full Strike Frenzy, Vicariant, Death Pit, Manic Outburst, Nightkin, and Tomb of Teeth ruling the underground, and mainstream successes such as Factory 81, Halloween, Cult is Life, Negative Approach, Repulsion, Wolfhook, Battlecross, King A10, and Black Dahlia Murder bringing attention to the scene. Michigan has no shortage of bands. It has gone through its ups and downs, but the metal in Michigan isn't going anywhere. Michigan truly is the home to Detroit Metal City.